12 years after the fall of the fourth Hokage, the village hidden in leaves has regained its military and economic power. The attack of the nine-tailed demon fox, although brief, was enough to threaten the stability of the shinobi world. The third Hokage, pulled out of retirement, worked towards strengthening Konoha's position amongst the Great Five. The new host of the Nine Tails Demon Fox received the personal attention of some of the most elite shinobi in Konoha and rose into the ranks of ANBU at a young age. The ANBU knelt, a black cloak spooled around the knees, and awaited orders. The elite ANBU's posture was perfectly still, obedient and subservient, as the third Hokage stood there. The silence in the room was stiffening, the ANBU guard hiding in the shadows fidgeting, but the loyal ANBU did not move. The Hokage's face was like stone, weathered and wearied, yet there was something lurking in his eyes, something that had allowed him to reign over the most powerful hidden village for decades. Many called it the Will of Fire. "Rise, Kitsune," the third Hokage said. He clasped his wrinkled hands behind his back and watched from beneath his conical hat as one of his most loyal and powerful warriors rose in a single deft movement. "I have called you here to undertake a S-rank mission. It is, of course, optional should you choose to decline but dash." "I accept," came the immediate response from the ANBU Kitsune. The white mask gleamed under the light of the office. The intimidating red stripes curled up into an angry snarl. Nonetheless, there was no emotion in the highly skilled ANBU's voice. "There never was." "Very well," the third Hokage murmured. He reached into his robes and patted his pockets for a few moments. Then, without a single gesture, the ANBU in the corner flickered and vanished. A second later, the guard reappeared holding the infamous Hokage's pipe. "Ah, thank you," Sarutobi muttered. He lit his pipe and took a few puffs. "Kitsune, rendezvous with Delta Platoon at the coordinates provided in this scroll. You will provide assistance to complete their task. It is vital for village security that this mission is completed. You have 2.5 hours. Time is of the essence." "I understand," Kitsune said solemnly as the Hokage passed over the sealed and bound scroll. "I will not fail you, Kahama." Then, without another word, Kitsune disappeared. There was no flicker of chakra or breeze of wind to accompany the disappearance. One moment Kitsune was there. The next moment, Kitsune was gone. The third Hokage continued to puff on his pipe, clouds of smoke billowing out and hovering around him in a haze of thick-scented fog. The ANBU in the corner of the room made a hand sign and the walls of the Hokage's office flashed for a second, a circle of glowing symbols flashing in and out of existence. All at once, the stiffening silence in the room was lifted. "Ferret!" the Hokage commanded. The ANBU in the corner straightened as Sarutobi walked back to his desk and, with a small grunt, sat back down in his chair. A small stack of papers lay waiting for him, highly classified documents that could not be delegated to the appropriate department. "Your orders, Hokage-sama?" the ANBU in the corner muttered. "I feel rather burdened today," Sarutobi said. "Go and prepare my calligraphy set. I will be there later. Wait for me there." "Sir," Ferret acknowledged and disappeared with a small puff of smoke. The Hokage sat back in his chair and continued to smoke his pipe. There was a lot riding on this mission. He could only hope that Kitsune would pull through. After some years, the threat of war diminished and the cycle began to repeat itself. Old heroes would fall and new ones would rise up and replace them. One such hero of Konoha is Kitsune, an elite and well-trained ANBU on par with some of the most powerful jounin in the world. Later on in the day, in one of the Hokage's personal rooms within the tower, Ferret finished unpacking the calligraphy set and stood back up with a small sigh. Almost as if he had predicted it, Sarutobi appeared at the doorway. "My cloak," the old man said with a straight face and twinkling eyes. Ferret nodded and took the cloak of the Hokage. He felt the fabric through his fingers as he hung it up on a peg. The third Hokage nodded and took another drag of his pipe, only to frown as the last glowing embers of the tobacco went out. "That's unfortunate," Sarutobi murmured. He stroked his beard and glanced at Ferret from the corner of his eye. "Did you, perchance, forget to refill my pipe?" The ANBU paused. "Perhaps, Hokage-sama," he said after a short while. "My apologies." "There's no need to apologize," Sarutobi chuckled. He moved over and knelt down before a large scroll. "I have become accustomed to my elite shinobi failing their missions ever since I took you on. It was quite a difficult task for somebody of your caliber." The ANBU tensed. For a moment, the white mask seemed to scream at the Hokage, before the person behind it managed to compose himself. He bowed. "My apologies again, my lord." "My lord," Sarutobi muttered and chuckled. My, you have become rather good at apologizing, haven't you? Still, it can't be helped when you manage to continually fail your routine missions." Ferret twitched. "Perhaps I should give you another try," Sarutobi muttered as he picked up a fine brush and dipped it in his ink. "Take my hat and place it with my coat." Ferret moved in to take the hat, but Sarutobi stopped him. "I warn you, I suspect that enemy shinobi may intercept you on your mission. There is a high chance that you will fail it, like usual." A strange noise came from behind Ferret's mask, and Sarutobi couldn't hide the genuine amusement on his face. The elderly shinobi cleared his throat. "However, I suppose I should give you a chance to explain yourself. After all, you are behaving very well today." "Hokage." Ferret trailed off. "Go on," Sarutobi urged. He gave a small smile that crinkled up his face. "I'm very impressed with your behavior, but I know that you must be very eager to speak your mind, so I shall allow it." "My mind?" Ferret repeated. "You want me to speak my mind?" Kitsune is an A-ranked shinobi gifted in all of the fields of battle. Taijutsu, ninjutsu, genjutsu, fuinjutsu, kenjutsu. There is no domain that Kitsune cannot claim some proficiency at. Kitsune's mission score is impressive and his exploits will undoubtedly go down in legend. The ferret mask came flying off the ANBU's head, and a pair of cerulean blue eyes glared at the elderly Hokage with righteous anger. "Damn it, old man." Uzumaki Naruto howled. "Don't treat me like a common servant." 3 marks, like whiskers, stretched the young ANBU's cheeks as his face twisted into a fierce scowl. The boy, who couldn't have been older than 12 or 13, was dressed in ANBU armor plates covering the backs of his arms and gray armor strapped over his black tunic and pants. 3 pouches hung on his waist and a bandage was wrapped around his right thigh. All in all, he was hardly an intimidating or imposing figure. The Hokage looked genuinely confused. I'm afraid I don't understand, Naruto," he said. A smile flickered on his face. "As one of my loyal ANBU and my personal bodyguard, I was under the impression that you were my servant." This is his story, the story of the ANBU named Uzumaki Naruto. Personally trained by the Third Hokage from a young age, Naruto entered the ranks of Genin at 8, Chunin at 10, and ANBU shortly after. Listed as a B-ranked shinobi in the latest bingo book, Naruto is the personal assistant and bodyguard of the legendary god of shinobi, the Third Hokage of the village hidden in the leaves. Essentially, Naruto was his servant. "You're impossible." Naruto snapped. He folded his arms with a huff and pouted. Did you have to rub Kitsune in my face again? I find your dislike of Kitsune quite interesting, Sarutobi chuckled. He began to paint, his weathered old hands moving deftly despite his age. I would assume that you would look up to your senior officers as role models. He is talented and you could learn much about the ways of the shinobi from him. Yeah, but Kitsune is such a. Naruto seemed to be at a loss for words. Loyal and powerful shinobi? Sarutobi supplied. No, not that, Naruto snapped. Comprehension dawned on his face and he snapped his fingers. Arsehole. Yeah, that's the word. Kitsune is an arsehole. Sarutobi chuckled good-naturedly and looked behind Naruto. Young blonde boy cocked his head in confusion before horror dawned on his face. He's standing right behind me, isn't he? He mouthed at Sarutobi, who merely smiled. Report, Sarutobi said. Mission complete. Naruto heard Kitsune's voice and closed his eyes in resignation. Good work, Kitsune, Sarutobi praised. Your skill and dedication do you credit. There will be a debriefing with the commander in 15 minutes. I will be there shortly. Yes, sir. And then the ANBU was gone. I hate you, Naruto muttered with a scowl. How unfortunate, Sarutobi responded dryly. He stood up and motioned to Naruto, who rolled his eyes but obediently retrieved the Hokage's hat and cloak. Once Sarutobi had finished dressing himself, he waved Naruto off. You're dismissed, Naruto. Report back at 1,700 hours to complete routine assignment 4E. For once, could you make your own dinner? Naruto muttered under his breath. He retrieved his mask and gave a short, clipped bow to the Hokage as protocol demanded. I don't suppose you could talk to the commander about that matter we discussed earlier? Sarutobi chuckled. I rather like your mask, to be honest, he said and waved Naruto off. Go, you little brat. Enjoy yourself while you can. Tomorrow I need you to watch Konoha, and I'm sure you'll want to be well rested for that. I hate you so much sometimes, boss, Naruto said with abject horror. Perhaps I should give you another try, Sarutobi muttered as he picked up a fine brush and dipped it in his ink. Take my hat and place it with my coat. Ferret moved in to take the hat, but Sarutobi stopped him. I warn you, I suspect that enemy shinobi may intercept you on your mission. There is a high chance that you will fail it, like usual. A strange noise came from behind Ferret's mask, and Sarutobi couldn't hide the genuine amusement on his face. The elderly shinobi cleared his throat. However, I suppose I should give you a chance to explain yourself. After all, you are behaving very well today. Hokage. Ferret trailed off. Go on, Sarutobi urged. He gave a small smile that crinkled up his face. I'm very impressed with your behavior, but I know that you must be very eager to speak your mind, so I shall allow it. My mind? Ferret repeated. You want me to speak my mind? Kitsune is an A-ranked shinobi gifted in all of the fields of battle. Taijutsu, ninjutsu, genjutsu, fuinjutsu, kenjutsu. There is no domain that Kitsune cannot claim some proficiency at. Kitsune's mission score is impressive and his exploits will undoubtedly go down in legend. The ferret mask came flying off the ANBU's head, and a pair of cerulean blue eyes glared at the elderly Hokage with righteous anger. Damn it, old man. Uzumaki, Naruto howled. Don't treat me like a common servant. 3 marks, like whiskers, stretched the young ANBU's cheeks as his face twisted into a fierce scowl. The boy, who couldn't have been older than 12 or 13, was dressed in ANBU armor plates covering the backs of his arms and gray armor strapped over his black tunic and pants. 3 pouches hung on his waist and a bandage was wrapped around his right thigh. All in all, he was hardly an intimidating or imposing figure. The Hokage looked genuinely confused. I'm afraid I don't understand, Naruto," he said. A smile flickered on his face. "As one of my loyal ANBU and my personal bodyguard, I was under the impression that you were my servant." This is his story, the story of the ANBU named Uzumaki Naruto. Personally trained by the Third Hokage from a young age, Naruto entered the ranks of Genin at 8, Chunin at 10 and ANBU shortly after. Listed as a B-ranked shinobi in the latest bingo book, Naruto is the personal assistant and bodyguard of the legendary god of shinobi, the Third Hokage of the village hidden in the leaves. Essentially, Naruto was his servant. "You're impossible," Naruto snapped. He folded his arms with a huff and pouted. "Did you have to rub kitsune in my face again?" "I find your dislike of kitsune quite interesting," Sarutobi chuckled. He began to paint, his weathered old hands moving deftly despite his age. "I would assume that you would look up to your senior officers as role models. He is talented and you could learn much about the ways of the shinobi from him." "Yeah, but kitsune is such a..." Naruto seemed to be at a loss for words. "Loyal and powerful shinobi?" Sarutobi supplied. "No, not that," Naruto snapped. Comprehension dawned on his face and he snapped his fingers. "Arsehole." "Yeah, that's the word. Kitsune is an arsehole." Sarutobi chuckled good-naturedly and looked behind Naruto. Young blonde boy cocked his head in confusion before horror dawned on his face. "He's standing right behind me, isn't he?" he mouthed at Sarutobi, who merely smiled. "Report," Sarutobi said. "Mission complete." Naruto heard Kitsune's voice and closed his eyes in resignation. "Good work, Kitsune," Sarutobi praised. "Your skill and dedication do you credit. There will be a debriefing with the commander in 15 minutes. I will be there shortly." "Yes, sir." And then the ANBU was gone. "I hate you," Naruto muttered with a scowl. "How unfortunate," Sarutobi responded dryly. He stood up and motioned to Naruto, who rolled his eyes but obediently retrieved the Hokage's hat and cloak. Once Sarutobi had finished dressing himself, he waved Naruto off. "You're dismissed, Naruto. Report back at 1,700 hours to complete routine assignment 4E. For once, could you make your own dinner?" Naruto muttered under his breath. He retrieved his mask and gave a short, clipped bow to the Hokage as protocol demanded. "I don't suppose you could talk to the commander about that matter we discussed earlier?" Sarutobi chuckled. "I rather like your mask, to be honest," he said and waved Naruto off. "Go, you little brat. Enjoy yourself while you can. Tomorrow I need you to watch Konoha, and I'm sure you'll want to be well rested for that." "I hate you so much sometimes, boss," Naruto said with abject horror. 3 dark figures bounded through the air, little more than streaks of darkness against the green foliage of the forest. They leapt from branch to branch, moving at incredible speeds as they raced towards their destination. The trees rumbled and shuddered and the wind brought the sounds of distant cracks and whines, explosive tags and elemental jutsu clashing as the two sides waged war against each other. A flash illuminated the afternoon sky as a great ball of fire rocketed up past the trees. One of the moving figures cocked his head back at his comrades and his fingers flashed in. 2 other figures nodded and in a great burst of speed they leapt from the trees and onto their unsuspecting target. White and red robes billowed out in the wind as Sarutobi Hiruzen, the Third Hokage, turned his head to meet them. One of the attackers flung his arm forward and kunai rushed forward. Sarutobi slightly shifted his head and the kunai missed, embedding into the ground. The Hokage raised his hands, fingers twisting through hand seals in a blur, and a huge gust of wind struck the group. Two of the attackers righted themselves and dove to the ground while the other one was overcome and was sent flying. A set of shurikens slammed into the disorientated shinobi and took him out of the fight, while the two others leapt at the Hokage. One drew a sword, the other formed a hand seal and inhaled. It was over in a flash. A fire technique burst into existence and was brutally suppressed as a long rod of earth exploded from the ground and slammed into the attacking man's stomach. At the same time, Sarutobi tapped the ground with his foot and the ground around him rippled. A loud shudder rumbled through the ground and the set of kunai embedding in the ground around him, the same set with hissing explosive tags wrapped around the handles, exploded from the ground. The other attacked didn't even have time to blink as they exploded around him and finished him off. The encounter was over in less than 10 seconds. Hokage-sama! An ANBU flickered into view, crouching down and waiting for orders. The enemy leader has advanced on the field. Sarutobi nodded grimly, rubbing his short goatee. He tapped his ear, his dark brown eyes tightening in annoyance. "Communications are down," he grunted. He raised his hand, clicked his fingers and watched as two more ANBU appeared before him. "Teams Alpha and Charlie will continue flanking maneuvers," he commanded. "I will take Team Delta and pacify the enemy's advance." "Go!" "Yes, Hokage-sama." The ANBU left in a swirl of leaves and Sarutobi adjusted the Kage's hat on the top of his head. He motioned to the ANBU by his side and disappeared in a burst speed that far outstripped the younger and more physically able shinobi by his side. A few moments later and the trees began to thin. Smoke billowed out in the distance and the sound of metal clanging on metal became more distinct. Blurs rushed through the trees, some clashing with each other in a burst of sparks as kunai and swords met. A nearby blur paused on a branch, hands blurring in seals, and a torrent of water burst from the ground, destabilizing the enemy's position. The ANBU attacked, black cloaks meeting those with gray, and Sarutobi was pleased by the efficiency of his forces as they quickly dispatched the enemy. "Where is he?" Sarutobi spoke to the nearest ANBU, who bowed her head respectfully. 150 meters ahead in the clearing, the ANBU female reported. Her purple hair swayed behind her back, practically inviting the enemy to use it as leverage, but Sarutobi's eyes could see the minuscule telltale signs of chakra embodied through it. "We've secured the outer perimeter and await your orders." "Very well," Sarutobi nodded. He drew himself up and flexed his chakra. The ANBU were well trained enough not to flinch, but some of them certainly tensed as the god of shinobi prepared to let loose. "I will suppress the enemy's defenses. On my signal, move forward to attack." "Yes, sir." Sarutobi drew himself up and his hand flashed through a series of hand seals. Chakra exploded from his elderly frame and the wind howled. Sarutobi melded the elemental chakra of earth, wind and water alongside each other and combined 5 separate techniques into a single rush of power. The ground burst open as geysers of water gushed to the surface and a tidal wave of water and mud, propelled by a shrieking gale, exploded past the tree line and into the heart of the enemy defenses. "Go!" Sarutobi barked as he lowered his hands and his loyal ANBU sprang forward, a dozen dark blurs leaping past the devastating effects of his technique to disappear behind the tree line. As they left, Sarutobi took a deep breath and followed them in a burst of speed. He reappeared in the middle of what used to be a clearing. Now it was a pit of muddied water, the ground cracked and broken. Whatever traps that the enemy had set up had been washed away by the power of his technique. As black and gray cloaked figures clashed with each other high above in the trees, the enemy of the shinobi army stood in the clearing, waiting with his arms folded. "I am the Third Hokage," Sarutobi said grimly, landing in the mud and water and walking across the surface. His white and red robes were somehow pristine despite the muck about them. "You have made an enemy of my village. I will accept your unconditional surrender, and in return, I will spare your life." "I see," Sarutobi murmured, closing his eyes briefly. "You escaped my attack by tunneling underground, and now you expect to jump up from behind me dash." The ground behind him exploded as something flashed up, metal glinting in the sun. Sarutobi dodged the first swipe and blocked the second with his forearm guards, looking amused. Naruto grinned back at him, his face sooty and streaked with water and mud. "Man," Naruto whistled. "Fighting against the Third Hokage is scary. So many collaborative techniques by a single shinobi. You really are a monster, aren't you?" Sarutobi grunted but said nothing. A cool wind blew through the clearing as Naruto pressed down against the aged Hokage with all his strength. For that split second, they were at an impasse. Naruto was too young to have the necessary bulk to force his kunai against Sarutobi's guard without both hands, and the Third Hokage could practically feel his bones creaking against the sheer pressure Naruto was bringing down on him already. The sound of metal scraping against metal grinded on Naruto's ears, and he felt a rush of satisfaction as Sarutobi was forced to take a step back, only to have a giant white-furred paw slam into him and grip him by the throat as Enma, the Monkey King, appeared with a burst of smoke. "Naruto!" Enma roared, his yellow eyes practically glowing with outrage. The headband of the summon glinted as Enma shoved his face right in front of the blonde ANBU. "What did you just say to your Hokage?" Naruto gurgled something, but he had the strange feeling that it was lost in translation underneath the crushing paws that gripped his throat. His grip on his kunai failed, and Sarutobi pushed away his flailing with ease. Naruto desperately tried to use the replacement technique, but the Monkey King had gripped him too tight for the technique to take effect. Although, there was the other way he could escape. But in the end it was easier to submit. Sarutobi leaned back, his foot flicking something up from the mud, and a kunai soared into the air. The Third Hokage grabbed it and with a backhanded blow, drove the unforgiving metal deep into Naruto's chest. Naruto grunted at the painful sensation, but it was nothing compared to the sensation of a real kunai. As soon as the metal had touched his chest, it had taken on a purplish-orange haze. The seals embedded in his training uniform also reacted, resulting in a display of fuinjutsu that the young demon host didn't really understand, but made the kunai only moderately irritating. Alas, Naruto deadpanned. "I have fallen." His quip probably would have sounded better if it hadn't come from the gurgles and gasps he was still emitting as Enma squeezed tighter and tighter. "That's enough, I think," Sarutobi wheezed. He appeared to be breathing a little harder than usual, although it was hard to tell with him. Enma complied and disappeared with a puff of smoke. Naruto gasped for air as he fell to the ground, reveling in the sensation of cool air flowing to his lungs. He panted as Sarutobi straightened out his clothing. During that fight, his robes hadn't even gotten muddy. Naruto scowled as he slowly clambered to his feet. "Ferret," Sarutobi murmured, his eyes taking in the devastation around him. In the nearby distance, battles were still being fought. "Transmit this to all other operatives. Operation message #3C. The operation has concluded. All ANBU, report for further orders." Naruto made a grunt in the back of his throat but complied. His fingers drifted over the red swirl of the ANBU tattoo on his shoulder and he channeled chakra into it. A small flash of smoke swirled around him. When it cleared, Naruto was dressed in his ANBU garb, a white porcelain mask covering his face. Naruto carefully went through a dozen hand seals and placed the palm of his hand on his ANBU tattoo. All throughout the forest around them, ANBU operatives battling at each other stilled as a message was telepathically transmitted across the short distance. Attention, all active ANBU forces within training group #7 ANBU operative designated as Ferret brings operation orders #3C. Orders are as follows. Operation concluded. Success to team designated as Red. Report to grid coordinates 1367 for orders. It was no Yamanaka technique, but it did the job. Naruto removed his hand and waited for the horribly dizzying sensation that always accompanied him when he used the technique. He was sure that the Third Hokage could have easily performed the technique himself. A massive wave of nausea and a sudden blinding migraine struck him. But if the Hokage wanted to do all of the grunt work, then he wouldn't have fast-tracked a naive genin into becoming his personal assistant all those years ago, would he? Naruto waited out the aftereffects of his techniques, which were not surprising considering his age and proficiency in the arts of mental communication and warfare. There was a reason why the techniques were usually learned specifically by communication officers and few others. As his headache abated, he could hear the sound of ANBU appeared in the clearing. It was a soft, almost inaudible sound. A small, quiet displacement of air and elite shinobi appeared from well-timed body flicker techniques and landing silently on the mud-soaked and scorched earth. Most would have missed it. Naruto was just that good. He hoped. So was Sarutobi, it seemed, as he continued to rest his eyes until he heard the arrival of the last ANBU operative, a man whose armor had cracked and fallen apart waist-height. The ANBU took their training seriously. The operation has concluded, Sarutobi said quietly, but his voice was heard by all in the clearing. The rebel uprising led by former ANBU operative Uzumaki Naruto has been suppressed. As the leaders of both sides of the rebellion, he and I have reached a satisfactory conclusion. Naruto's eyes widened and he wanted to whimper. Uzumaki will take full responsibility for his actions. Sarutobi thundered. Some of the ANBU snickered as the sheer agony that was radiating off the ferret-masked blonde by the Hokage's side. All ANBU operatives in the team designated as Blue will be integrated back into the rank and file. Uzumaki Naruto, as the leader of the insurrection, shall provide compensation to each and every single one of you on top of additional administrative duties. Wait, what? Naruto cried out. Sarutobi reached over and absently whacked his assistant across the back of his head. The sheer force of the plated arm guard sent Naruto sprawling into the mud. Without skipping a beat, the Third Hokage continued. All food and leisure costs will be reimbursed directly from the failed rebel, Uzumaki Naruto. Sarutobi concluded. Spare no expense on his account. As a traitor, he must learn from his mistakes. Compensation will be personally delivered by the little brat, as well as a most sincere apology for his actions. Had he merely accepted his fate, we would not have had to perform our operational training drills again so soon. ANBU teams Alpha through Delta, you are dismissed. Many of the ANBU chuckled out loud. Some of them called out cheerful thanks to Naruto and waved. Naruto remained oblivious to it all as he lay in the mud, scowling fiercely. The masked figures disappeared after a few moments, more than willing to have a night on the town at the poor blonde's expense. Why? Naruto cried out as he threw his hands in the air. He wailed to the heavens despondently. Why me? What did I do to deserve this? Sarutobi took out his pipe, puffing on it solemnly. Learn from your mistakes, Naruto, he said sternly, not hiding his amusement at all. He puffed out some smoke. The next time I ask you to complete some paperwork, it had better be done. Are we understood? Yes, boss. Naruto wept pitifully as he climbed up from the mud. Sarutobi chuckled as his blonde assistant and ANBU guard took his customary place on his left side. He reached out with one hand and ruffled the boy's locks of hair fondly. Now, he said, let's talk about our little spar, shall we? I noticed that your lightning manipulation was quite poorly channeled. With your level of chakra, I expect better from you. If an old man like me can defeat you so easily, then you need to train more. Yes, boss, Naruto replied blandly. Quiet. I wasn't done. Sarutobi whacked Naruto over the back of his head and hid a grin at his subordinate's furious reaction. Located in the heart of Fire Country, Konoha was regarded as the largest military and economic power within all of the elemental countries. Boasting of a shinobi population of over 10,000, Konoha served not only as a military force but one of the primary driving forces of Fire Country's economy. Clients from the Land of Fire and beyond highly valued the work ethic and efficiency of Konoha's shinobi, and Leaf Shinobi were the first choice by many when a task needed to be done. Each day, hundreds of shinobi teams would leave and return to the village to complete missions. The majority of these were made up of C and D-ranked missions, suitable for Konoha's well-trained and diverse field of Chunin and Genin. For the most part, clients visiting Konoha would be directed to the mission assignment desk located in the administrative section of the academy. There, Chunin would take down the mission details, organize teams to complete said missions, and accept payments. It was a well-oiled machine that made use of the vast majority of rank-and-file shinobi. Failed graduates of the Shinobi Academy usually found themselves in bureaucratic positions or acting as messengers, while the average Chunin team would complete the vast majority of the missions. While it wasn't as glamorous as the high-risk and dangerous missions handed out at the Hokage's tower to the elite, these jobs generated a large percentage of Konoha's revenue and were seen vital to village prosperity. It was for that reason that Sarutobi Hiruzen, the third Hokage of the village hidden in leaves, would often leave the Hokage tower and direct many of these missions personally. Not only was he able to meet the clientele, many who were suitably impressed by the infamous god of shinobi, but it gave him a chance to work with the average shinobi that generally would not get a chance to interact with their leader. As the Hokage's personal guard and assistant, Uzumaki Naruto would usually accompany him. Between filing reports, meeting with clients, scheduling meetings, and even assigning missions, the young ANBU agent received his share of Konoha's bureaucratic juggernaut with not-so-quiet dignity. Sarutobi puffed happily on his pipe as he adjusted the conical hat on his head. A white cloak draped over his red full-length gown. He sat at the head of a large wooden table, one of many. Around him, scores of Chunin hustled busily, taking down mission details, referring clients to other Chunin, and bundling paperwork to be sorted and filed. Teams of ninja would occasionally enter, greet their client, and leave. It was an efficient system first started by the second Hokage and continued by his successor. My Lord Hokage, greeted an enthusiastic man. He was rather round and large, with the strange curly hairstyle favored by the nobles of the fire court. Your health appears well. Sarutobi puffed once more and removed the pipe from his lips, the predominant lines under his eyes curving up as he smiled. Greetings, Lord Shinji, he replied back. He coughed once into his hand. "How may our village assist you today?" "I require a team of your best spies," Shinji replied, and his face darkened. He leaned forward, his eyes furtively darting around the room. "I think you know who is going to make his move. I must have accurate intelligence if I am to counter." "I see," Sarutobi murmured, stroking his small goatee. "Then, the contracts from the land of tea have not yet been finalized?" "Soon," Shinji said, frowning. He rubbed his hands on his fine clothes. "With your help, of course." "I recommend that you go and see Naren and give him your details," Sarutobi said. "We shall, of course, provide you with some of our finest chunin." "Excellent," Shinji bowed deeply. "My thanks, Hokatsuma." Sarutobi smiled and moved his pipe back in his mouth as the portly noble walked off. He puffed a few more times, his eyes flickering to his right. "Ferret," he barked. There was a crash of paper and a cry of dismay. Naruto, clad in his sleeveless armor, too bared for the world to see, had been startled and lost his grip on the large stack of paperwork he had been carefully balancing. Scrolls and paperwork went flying and fell to the ground in a huge mess, leaving a despondent ANBU. "Pick up that mess this instant," Sarutobi grunted. "This is the center of Konoha's business, not a rubbish heap." Naruto began scooping up the paper from the wooden floor. Sarutobi watched with a keen eye. "Remember," he said as Naruto began to load his arms again, "many short trips will make light work of one hard task." "Your laces are undone," Sarutobi said. He nodded sagely. "Remember, you will never overcome large hurdles when the smallest of obstacles threaten to entangle you." "Begging your pardon, sir," Naruto said with forced politeness. "But I'm wearing sandals." "Oh," Sarutobi uttered. He paused, thoughtfully puffing on his pipe. "Well then, never mind." He dismissed Naruto with a wave of his hand. "Hurry up. Those scrolls will not file themselves." A loud pop roared through the room, startling clients and chunin alike as Naruto disappeared with a loud cloud of smoke and the sound of grinding teeth. Several of the other shinobi were snickering, and even Sarutobi was outright chuckling. The third Hokage's good mood abruptly vanished, however, as he felt a familiar presence approaching. His face smoothed over as he drew himself up, masking his slight puzzlement with well-practiced ease. Out of the busy room, he was undoubtedly one of the only ones who saw the man enter, sliding between clients and shinobi effortlessly and making his way towards Sarutobi. "Danzo," Sarutobi said as way of a greeting. "What brings you to the mission assignment desk?" Danzo Shimura inclined his head respectfully. He leaned heavily on his cane, his right arm done up in a sling and his torso heavily bandaged. Despite his apparent physical injuries, his chakra was sharp and potent. His one single eye betrayed his appearance as a cripple, aged and scarred as he was. Danzo was still a warrior at heart, despite his retirement as head of the special ANBU division route. Trailing after him was a young boy with jet black hair, pale skin and dark eyes. "Hokatsuma," Danzo greeted and raised his head. "I was merely showing my latest students around Konoha's areas of importance." "Your latest student," Sarutobi repeated quietly. "Of course," Danzo said without any emotion. "There are still those who regard my skills quite highly. It's an honor to pass on what I know to the next generation." Sarutobi grunted at that. "Ferret," he barked. This time, Naruto appeared by his side flawlessly, his face hidden by his ANBU mask. The young bodyguard had undoubtedly felt the familiar chakra as well, and after several years in Sarutobi's service knew that Danzo was somebody not to be trifled with. "So that's..." Danzo trailed off, a thoughtful expression flittering over his face. It was hard to read the emotions of a man who had half his face covered in thick bandages. "We meet again, Elder," Naruto greeted coolly. He turned and bowed deep to Sarutobi. "How may I serve you, Hokage-sama? Could you please prepare a small room so that Danzo and I may catch up?" Sarutobi requested quietly. He stood up, his white cloak fluttering as he moved. "We shall be there shortly." At once, Naruto responded and disappeared. A few minutes later, Sarutobi and Danzo adjourned to a more private setting. Naruto had done well, Sarutobi absently thought, as both he and Danzo took a seat at a long, highly polished wooden table. Naruto was nearby, quietly preparing a steaming pot of tea, while Danzo's latest student stood behind his tutor. "And what would your name be?" Sarutobi inquired gently, puffing on his pipe and eyeing the pale boy shrewdly. He looked to be Naruto's age, but the third Hokage could see the leanness of muscle displayed, the unnatural attention that the boy paid to movement and perfect balance that he seemed to have. The boy's smile was horrific, as bland and empty as a corpse. "I am called Sai," he said. He bowed his head, not a hair of fraction out of place. "It's an honor to meet you, Tokahama." Sarutobi grunted. "I'm sure he told you to say that," he replied, feeling irritable all of a sudden. "Ferret, where's my tea?" "I will be there momentarily, Naruto replied evenly, his back facing the table as he bent down, focused on his work. "If I may, Hokage-sama?" Danzo requested and leaned forward. "I would like a demonstration." "Oh." Sarutobi raised an eyebrow. "Of what, exactly?" Danzo smiled. In a flash of movement, Sai lunged at Sarutobi with speed far beyond those of his age level. A sword appeared in his hand as he streaked across the long wooden table in the span of a heartbeat. Deadly intent flashed through the room, and Sarutobi's eyes widened fractionally as he read the young man's eyes. There was no doubt, the boy was aiming to kill. His attack lasted a whole 2 seconds, and he didn't even make it halfway across the table. Naruto was there to meet him, the masked ANBU suddenly radiating a terrible aura of power. Dark, heavy, and oppressing chakra flooded the room. The wooden table began to crack and the rack of saucers and cups rattled. The sword met a kunai and the two young boys locked arms. Despite his emotionless face, Sarutobi could read the surprise in his would-be assassin's movements as 4 more Narutos suddenly surrounded him. Blank-face ANBU masks peered down at the would-be attacker with no mercy, and kunai lashed out at vital points. The young boy immediately jumped back, Naruto's kunais only barely missing the killing blow. His blood splattered across the table, and Naruto followed up with a devastating kick that launched Sai away from the Hokage. He flew down the table and past Danzo, who didn't even look ruffled as his apprentice slammed into the wall with a dull thump. All 5 Narutos were in the process of weaving through hand seals when Sarutobi raised a hand. "Enough," he murmured. Naruto paused, angry dark chakra whirling around him. "Naruto, leave us." "Boss." Naruto protested. "I am not so weak that I need you to fight my battles." Sarutobi snapped. He snapped his fingers and Naruto reluctantly backed down, the shadow clones shimmering from existence, the heavy pressure abruptly vanishing from the room. "Take our young foolish attacker to the medical center." Sarutobi could tell that Naruto was absolutely furious with the order, but if there was one thing that Naruto had learned after 5 years working with the third Hokage, it was that the old man did not like to repeat himself. Naruto walked over to blood-splattered Sai, hoisted his body over his shoulder with some effort, and disappeared. "What ominous chakra?" Danzo murmured. He stood, limping his way across the table towards the pot of tea. With a single deft hand, the crippled elder flawlessly continued on from where Naruto had left off and handed Sarutobi a cup of steaming tea. I haven't felt chakra like that since you were a child, Hiruzen. Sarutobi grunted and tucked his pipe inside his robes. Naruto has potential, was all he said as he took a sip. He is quite talented. That's an understatement, Danzo said with a dry chuckle. With a cup of tea balanced on the back of his hand, he leaned on his walking stick and made his way to the other end of the table. Both men ignored the large crack and dripping blood in the middle of the table. He is very impressive for a child so young. I can only think of a few who showed such potential at his age. Kakashi, Sarutobi supplied. Itachi, Orochimaru. Tsukumo. Yourself, Danzo countered. He leaned his walking stick against the table and sipped his tea. I would suggest that he is more like you than the others. That chakra was very much like yours during your early years when you struggled to find control, and he is not burdened with the broken bonds of family as many of those other names were. He carries his burden well, Sarutobi admitted. There was no mistaking the pride in his voice. He is strong and quick to learn. He does not have arrogance, Danzo said quietly, and Sarutobi stilled. Kakashi, Orochimaru, they were both arrogant. It took a tragedy to break Kakashi's, and Orochimaru never lost his. Sarutobi let out a snort of laughter. Naruto is too busy cleaning up after his mistakes to worry about his status, he said, chuckling. He can be a clumsy boy, foolish at times. Very foolish, Danzo agreed, taking another sip. What young shinobi uses the god of shinobi as a measuring stick against his skills? To compare himself to such a man, it would keep any shinobi level-headed. The two sat in comfortable silence, sipping their tea. I must say, Danzo murmured after a few moments, Uzumaki Naruto has many of the qualities of an aspiring Hokage. Sarutobi said nothing. Ah, Danzo uttered and closed his eye. He bowed his head, looking in deep thought. I see. Partially, Sarutobi supplied and saw the first glimmer of a frown on his one-time rival's face. You have become most insufferable as of late, Hiruzen, Danzo said, setting down his now empty cup of tea. That boy has helped sharpen your blade, a far cry of who you were 10 years ago. He stood up, taking his cane. My advice to an old friend would be thus: don't ever slip back to what you once were. Is that so? Sarutobi replied quietly. His brown eyes watched Danzo carefully. That's very interesting advice. I would say useful, Danzo replied. His one eye hardened as he gazed down at the man who had beaten him to the hat. I will always do what's best for the village that we both love so much. As do I, said Sarutobi softly. Good, Danzo said abruptly. Continue to do so. The will of fire rests upon your shoulders. He turned around and began to limp out the door, leaving the third staring at nothing in particular, deep in thought. Naruto returned a few moments later. Hokage-sama, he inquired. He paused as the old man did not reply. Boss? The concern in his voice was evident. What's wrong? Sarutobi blinked. What's wrong? He repeated. His arm rose and he lashed out at Naruto, sending the masked blonde boy soaring through the air. Why is there a mess on this table? What's with that crack? Ferret, attend to your duties. Ow! Naruto groaned as he pulled himself free from the plaster and out of the wall that the third had just sent him flying into. You old bastard! He shook his fist. Don't get angry with me, boy. Sarutobi yelled as the fire returned to his veins. He glared at Naruto. You just put a hole in my wall. Explain yourself. What? But you... Naruto trailed off in a round of indignant splutters as the third abruptly whacked his head again. All right, he groaned, rubbing his abused head. I'll clean up, you wrinkled old slave driver. What was that? Sarutobi thundered. Nothing. Sarutobi watched Naruto carefully as the young assistant began to frantically clean up the room. A small smile flashed across his face, but it disappeared as soon as it came, and the third picked up his cup of tea and began to sip it between scoldings. One of the largest buildings in Konoha was the Hokage's residence, also known as the Hokage's Tower. It was located quite close to the Shinobi Academy and had been constructed just underneath the Hokage's monument. The Hokage's residence towered over most of the other buildings in Konoha and was home to many different departments. ANBU headquarters lay directly beneath it, guarded carefully by the elusive masked shinobi. There were libraries filled with countless scrolls, records of previous missions, character profiles of friendly and enemy shinobi, and thousands upon thousands of technique scrolls could all be found inside. The Third Hokage was infamously known for single-handedly learning and mastering each and every single technique scroll that Konoha had to offer. The Hokage's Tower was also where A and S-ranked missions were handed out to elite teams of Jonin and ANBU. Prestigious clients were sometimes given the privilege of visiting but rarely saw much activity, as elite-level shinobi received their missions and left with speeds too quick for the untrained eye to see. Matters of village security were also dealt here, far away from the prying eyes of the normal shinobi workforce. It was also where the Third Hokage and his family lived. Since his fast-tracked promotion to Chunin and allocation as the Hokage's personal assistant and guard, Uzumaki Naruto had been one of the few people in Konoha's history to call the Hokage's Tower home. Naruto suddenly opened his eyes. One moment he was asleep, and the next he was awake and alert. The young ANBU rolled over and glanced at his alarm clock. 6:59 a.m. He hopped out of bed, removing the froggy nightcap that he still loved so much and quickly pressing his thumb against the red spiraling tattoo on his exposed shoulder. He channeled chakra and his bedclothes abruptly vanished. A second pulse of chakra saw a set of armor appear neatly around his form. A pair of dulled metal arm guards covered his forearms, extending over his gloved hands. His upper arms were bare and he wore a tight black shirt with a gray armored vest covering his chest. His long dark pants reached his ankles, where he wore sandals, and there were 3 small pouches strapped around his waist with a bandage tied around his right leg. He hadn't put the mask on and it dangled from his utility belt. "Oh yeah," Naruto said with a cocky grin, exposing his sharper-than-normal canines. "I look awesome." After he was done checking himself out, he adjusted the mask on his belt and strode through the door. With a well-practiced movement, he turned off the clock just as it flipped from 6:59 to 7 o'clock and the first tones of the alarm went off. It was time for him to perform one of the most dangerous aspects of his job, waking up the Third Hokage. "Oi!" Naruto shouted loudly as he entered the master bedroom of the Hokage's residence. He felt an itching sensation around his ANBU tattoo as the complex barrier seals recognized his identity and allowed him to pass without reducing him to a pile of steaming ash. "It's time to wake up." The lump curled around the thick blankets in the middle of the king-sized poster bed quivered. Naruto rolled his eyes as he began stretching. He found it completely ridiculous that the rest of Konoha idolized Sarutobi as some kind of holier-than-thou figure of everlasting power and might. Only Naruto, he had decided firmly, knew the real truth. Sarutobi was a cranky, perverted old man who took way too much pleasure in abusing his poor loyal subordinates for his own amusement. Naruto, being in the position that he was, saw this the discreet reading of that oh-so-tempting orange book, the short giggles when the old man caught a glimpse of a beauty, the way the boss adjusted his hat to have his afternoon snooze in the busiest of places, and the way that the old man slept in every morning for the past 4.5 years. "Do we really have to do this again?" Naruto pleaded. It was a familiar question, as it was one he had to ask extremely often. He only received a grunt in response. He sighed. "Have it your own way, then?" He raised his hands and twisted then into a single hand seal. Water release. Waterfall technique. He heaved a breath and spat a mouthful of water, which sprayed through the air in an arc, hands contorting in another hand seal. The mouthful of water became a giant torrent which swept through the room and washed over the poster bed. His technique completed, Naruto shifted his weight and leapt up towards the roof, using chakra to grab a foothold on the ceiling. A second later, a shower of kunai pelted the floor where he had been standing with incredible force, smashing apart floorboards and tearing into carpet. "Good morning," Naruto exclaimed cheerfully as he dropped from the roof. "I will be serving breakfast in 10 minutes if you'd like to get ready, boss." Sarutobi emerged from the drenched wetlands that had once been his bed, his brown eyes bleary and his white hair wet with moisture. Apart from that, the third Hokage was completely dry, and Naruto absently wondered what technique the wily old man had used to escape his wake-up call this time. "What's with this mess?" Sarutobi grumbled loudly. He cleared his throat. "Clean this up immediately." Naruto just smiled. "Already on it, sir," he said cheerfully. He snapped his fingers and 3 shadow clones appeared in the room holding a mop, a bucket, a small roll of carpet, and a couple of new floorboards. "We'll have this fixed soon, so if you'd like to make your way to the kitchen." "Little smartarse," Sarutobi grumbled as he shuffled his way out of the room. None of the clones saw the little smile playing on his face. "Right?" the original Naruto said, folding his arms. Routine assignment #3 clean up the old man's mess begins. I'll go and make breakfast. You guys take care of this and then begin the morning training. He left as the first shadow clone made the ram sign and began to use water-based nature manipulation to suck out all of the moisture within the room and deposit in the bucket. The second was bending down and plucking the kunai out of the floor, and the third was stripping the Hokage's bed. It was a well-practiced routine and one they had done many times before, although the third Hokage didn't always use kunai. Breakfast time at the Sarutobi house was interesting, and Naruto would always find himself running around trying to take care of 5 things at once. The third Hokage would play with his breakfast, bowls of oats, plates of buttered toast, hot bacon and eggs, and fresh fruit merely being toyed with. The third's grandson, Konoha, would scoff down his food as soon as he got it, bits of it flying everywhere. Naruto would desperately try to get Konohamaru's lunch done in time while making the boy slow down and eat properly, and at the same time, forcing the third Hokage to eat at least a plateful before grabbing a bite himself. It hadn't always been this bad, Naruto reflected despondently. His hands were a blur as he wrapped up the last of Konohamaru's food and placed it in the bag. The third had been quite good to him when he first arrived, and he would usually join Konohamaru in his meals as the several staff did all the work. However, as Naruto grew into his responsibilities, the old man got worse and worse, until each morning was like wrestling with a wild boar. Sometimes Naruto thought that the Hokage's was deliberately doing it to piss him off. "You eat," Naruto barked, pointing one angry finger at the Hokage. The third was dressed in his long white robes and his conical hat was pointed downwards, shielding his eyes. If you snooze, then you're not going to get anything. Sarutobi grunted and made a noise that might have been one of agreement, and he lifted his hat. The old man yawned, absently toying with his bowl of porridge. Naruto glared at him until he caught movement at the corner of eye. He whirled around, blue eyes narrowing into slits. Kanemaru, with his arm cocked back and a plate of sauce-smeared bacon in his hand, froze with widened eyes. "Sit!" Naruto snapped. He appeared behind the young brat in a lightning-fast body flicker and forced him back on his seat. "Eat properly like a human instead of a monkey." Naruto sighed as Konohamaru continued to shovel food in his mouth. He glanced at Sarutobi, who had again hid his eyes behind his hat and was snoring quite loudly, and he sighed. "You're the Hokage of the most powerful shinobi village in the world. Stop slacking off and eat your breakfast." Naruto bellowed and Sarutobi jerked awake. The old man seemed to wilt underneath Naruto's dangerous look and began to quickly eat the food in front of him. Something hit him in the back of the head and there was a giggle. "Think that's funny, do you?" Naruto asked dangerously, spinning around to face the little boy. Konohamaru's giggles turned into full-blown laughter as Naruto buckled underneath a sudden heavy weight that slammed into his head. There was a crash as a bowl broke on his head and something warm and oozy dripped down into his hair. He glanced at the Hokage, whose eyes were closed and his arms still outstretched as he finished the last spoonful of his breakfast. "That's it." Sudden heavy and oppressive chakra filled the room. Konohamaru squeaked and Sarutobi's eyes opened a fraction as Naruto flipped through some hand seals. "Naruto, release!" he shouted angrily. "Breakfast shuriken technique." Chakra flared and the kitchen became a whirlwind of food as Naruto spread his arms around and the food on the table leapt from their plates and span right into the faces of Konohamaru and Sarutobi. Bacon followed the toast, which followed the eggs and fruit. The technique only lasted a few seconds, and by the end both occupants of the table were covered in food. "Right?" Naruto breathed as the room fell silent. He pointed at the third Hokage. "You will go and get washed up and ready for work. If you're not in your office at 9 a.m. sharp, then I'm not doing any of your paperwork for the day." Sarutobi jerked at that. "And you?" Naruto growled, spinning around to face Konohamaru. "You're coming with me to have another shower right now." "I don't want to," Konohamaru said defiantly. He folded his arms and turned away. "Listen here, brat." Naruto growled and shoved his face directly in front of the young boys. "There are two ways we can do this. The hard way where I throw you into cold shower, or the really hard way where I throw the cold shower at you." Konohamaru gulped. 20 minutes later, Naruto and Konohamaru were walking through the streets of Konoha towards the academy. The blonde-haired ANBU had cleaned himself up and was wearing his porcelain mask over his face. Konohamaru was pouting as Naruto led him past the shops and villagers, many of whom waved or bowed at the young boy. Naruto didn't miss several of them giving him strange looks and merely scoffed. His mask was on purely for protocol at this point because it wasn't like his identity was a secret to that many people. After all, how many short blonde ANBU members were there? Still, he supposed it was better than the looks he used to get. "Right?" Naruto said as the academy loomed up ahead. "Make sure you be good today. No pranks. No mucking around. If I have to come and catch you, you'll be sorry." Yeah, Konohamaru said with a jeer. He huffed. "As if you could find me." "Brat," Naruto said crossly, but he ruffled the young boy's hair affectionately. "It's your graduation exam today, isn't it?" "You remembered?" Konohamaru asked in surprise. He chuckled bitterly. "Of course you did. Gramps didn't." Naruto made a small sound of comprehension. I'm sure he knows, he said breezily. He didn't say anything at breakfast, Konohamaru muttered. He looked at the ground, kicking a small stone away. He just sat there being stupid again. You didn't say anything either, Naruto admonished. He wagged his finger. I swear, you two are both as bad as each other. You're definitely Sarutobi, you two. Konohamaru looked up hopefully as Naruto glanced down, smiling kindly behind his mask. There's no doubt about it, the ANBU said. He's definitely thinking about you today. Konohamaru beamed. Thanks, Naruto, he said quietly. As soon as the two entered the gates of the academy, he bolted off to find his friends, leaving Naruto holding his lunch alone. Come back. Naruto called out, but the brown-haired boy had disappeared amongst the milling crowds of parents and students. He sighed. You little shit. Naruto made his way through the academy grounds. The students he met had once given him wide-eyed looks and muttered to each other quietly. Now he was a regular occurrence, the young ANBU agent tasked with escorting the third's grandson to school. They still gave him the odd look, especially when they noted how short and young he seemed, but in the true fashion of children they mostly ignored him now. The parents were mostly the same, although he exchanged a respectful nod with Nara Shikaku, the current Jonin commander. The two had had dealings in the past. He also exchanged a quick hello with Yamanaka Inoichi, the tall blonde-haired man who worked in Konoha's intelligence division. Ah, Irika, Naruto called out. He flickered out of the crowd and appeared in front of the scarred Chunin, who had been turning to see who had called out his name. Ga! Irika jumped as he came face to face with the creepy porcelain mask of an ANBU member. He held his hand over his heart. Oh, it's you. Naruto held up the bag. This is Konohamaru's, he explained. The little brat ran off before I could give it to him. I see, Irika said. He took the bag. Thank you. His voice, as usual, was respectful and polite when he spoke to shinobi many called Sarutobi's right hand. Irika had just been assigned to the academy when Uzumaki Naruto, with the assistance of the Third Hokage, had graduated early. He hadn't had much to do with the young boy for years until he had reappeared from seemingly out of nowhere as the Hokage's personal assistant and guard. The ferret-masked boy had quickly become a common sight at the mission assignment office as he accompanied the Hokage and performed many duties. Personally, Irika felt a little sorry for him. The Hokage could be quite hard on the young ANBU, and Irika wondered if Naruto managed to ever get much of a break. Will Konohamaru do well today? Naruto asked, and Irika blinked, shaken out of his thoughts. It's hard to say, Irika admitted. He's certainly not the most academic-driven student we have. Naruto made a noise in the back of his throat at that, and Irika chuckled. That said, the scarred Chunin continued, his weapon skills and taijutsu is quite good. It's why he was moved ahead past his age group. He's already quite gifted in that area. Still, he's having some trouble with the henge. We'll have to see how he goes today. I see, Naruto said. He rubbed the back of his head. Well, I better be off. Thanks for speaking with me. You're welcome, Irika said. Goodbye, Naruto-san. The day proceeded like any other normal day. Naruto worked with the Third Hokage in the mission room, filling papers, organizing meetings, and taking down mission details. The Fire Daimyo's wife had arrived in Konoha a few days earlier and had already lost her pet on 4 different times. Several of Konoha's largest merchants were interested in obtaining a new breed of spice that was found growing in the land of rice, although many of them were reluctant to pay the higher mission costs required, as relations with the land of rice had been strangely distant and hostile than before. A quartet of shinobi from the village hidden in grass arrived with a routine message for the Hokage, and a dark-cloaked man wanted a team to perform a dangerous mission to retrieve his family heirloom and had been whisked away to the Hokage's tower to debrief the elite shinobi who would needed to complete a mission of that difficulty. All in all, nothing unusual. Later that afternoon, Naruto found himself leaping over the rooftops of Konoha delivering messages to various persons and businesses on behalf of the Mission Assignment Office and the Hokage. From what Naruto had gathered, most were receipts and a short message on the details of the successful mission needed to claim when applying for tax cuts. There was one curiously lumped parcel that had arrived from intentional delivery that had passed inspection, which was left at the reception desk of the Shinobi Academy. Naruto finished the last of his errands just as the sun was going down and made his way to the training grounds. Each day, he was officially given 2 hours to work on his physical training. Unofficially, however, Naruto trained all day long on the various different projects he was working on. "Yo!" Naruto called out as he entered the large training fields. It was the field that Naruto had selfishly allocated for himself, and it was perfect for his needs. It was a large clearing with a small river trickling through it. Surrounded by trees, the noises here would be muffled by the foliage and keep snooping visitors away. "Hey!" One of his shadow clones returned the greeting. There were whole groups of them there, and each was working on a specific aspect of Naruto's training. 5 groups of at least 10 clones worked on each part of his elemental nature manipulation, using leaves and chakra paper to hone his ability to generate elemental chakra. His natural affinity was wind, and it came to him as the easiest to form. However, the Hokage's natural affinity had been earth, but that hadn't stopped him from whipping out advanced elemental techniques of each nature in the past. Lightning was his worst at the moment, but his earth and water was coming along quite nicely, and as long as he didn't care about collateral damage, his fire worked beautifully. Naruto would not be satisfied until he had mastered each and every single affinity, just as the third Hokage had done before him. It really got to him when he considered just how much further he needed to go, especially when the old man would make offhanded comments along the lines of, "You're still learning this? Why, when I was your age I had already learned this as well as that. I guess you're just a slow learner." There was one group working on his chakra control, and they were contorted into weird poses. One of was handstanding on the water with one hand while using the other to swirl leaves around his palm. The other was hopping up and down a street while juggling spinning kunai. The last one was holding a spinning orb of chakra in his hand, a screeching noise emanating from the powerful technique that sent shivers down the real Naruto's back. That was probably the ultimate test in chakra control. The Rasengan, the powerful technique, worked by rotating multiple rows of dense chakra in different directions while keeping it contained in a stable sphere in one's hand. Naruto was working on the lethality of the technique, compressing his chakra even denser and trying to spin more and more of the chakra faster and in different directions. Naruto spied the piles of disposable ramen containers lying on the ground and rolled his eyes. "What a waste," he muttered to himself. He cleaned up the clearing as best he could and began to work on his techniques. The god of shinobi was famous for his collaborative techniques. When an average shinobi could perform a single technique in a few seconds, the third Hokage was able to weave through multiple techniques, often stopping partway through one to start another while keeping the different strands of elemental chakra separate from each other within his body and while empowering his limbs and muscles with chakra. That was the level of proficiency in nature, shape and chakra manipulation and control that Naruto was working towards. Naruto was not at that level yet, although he had a somewhat bastardized version that produced similar results. It involved working with clones, each who would focus on one specific technique, while Naruto would direct and combine them all together. That only worked because his clones used the same chakra as he did, and even though Naruto was a chakra juggernaut, the third one said that Naruto had more chakra at his age than he had, even that left him quite fatigued in the end. Shadow clone, Naruto muttered, and with a puff of smoke somebody appeared right next to him. His replica gave him a dry look. "This is going to hurt," he lamented. Naruto rolled his eyes. "Get over it," he snapped. The clone nodded and formed the ram sign. From there, Naruto watched as his clone went through a series of hand seals, his fingers blazing in and out of the signs quicker than the eye could see. He knew what was happening even as the clone did it: form water elemental chakra, compress it, store it in the tenketsu of the upper back where mobility would not be limited, form water elemental chakra, compress and release it into a technique. Earth release, great mudslide technique. Naruto's clone shouted. The earth before him rumbled and liquefied as Naruto's elemental chakra softened it, while his nature manipulation used his chakra to force it forward in an avalanche of mud. Naruto's clone made another sign and the water elemental chakra flowed forward. Water release, raging river technique. The water technique, coming from the small stream trickling into the clearing, combined with the power of the earth technique and produced a devastating current of mud and water. It propelled out from the shadow clone and swept into the forest. Saplings and plants were torn from their roots as the mud swept across the great tree trunks. An ideal conclusion to this combination technique would be a fire technique that would turn the mud into a rolling river of blistering tar that would engulf and consume all that it touched. However, Naruto was having enough trouble with 2 elemental chakra, let alone 3. Under the original's eye, the clone suddenly let out a gurgling noise. Bright points appeared all over the clone's body as tenketsu overloaded underneath the strain of the multiple strands of elemental chakra before it exploded in a puff of smoke. Naruto grimaced at the mildly unpleasant memory. Normally, the shadow clone technique would not include pain in the memory for the safety of the user, but Naruto had altered that part of the technique when he needed to so he could diagnose how and when a technique went wrong. Too much chakra, Naruto murmured to himself. Elemental composition was fine, but the tenketsu can't handle the strain. I need to disperse the chakra over multiple tenketsu. It was much, much harder than it sounded. Naruto went to make another clone when the tattoo burned on his shoulder. He frowned. The Hokage usually allowed, or rather, insisted on his training time. It was unusual for a summons this late. He snapped his fingers and his clones obediently dispelled. Naruto felt flashes of memories assault him, but he shrugged them off with practiced ease. Placing his mask over his face, he disappeared into a body flicker. He reappeared by the Hokage's side. The old man was standing on the highest level of the Hokage tower, watching the sun set over the Hokage's monument. Usually Naruto could get a good read on the third Hokage, but it was with some trepidation that he found himself unable to assess how his leader was feeling. The stone faces on the monument looked as if they held more emotion than Sarutobi did right at that moment. "Ferret," Sarutobi spoke softly and with the weight of a man who had spent his entire life giving orders and being obeyed. "The first directive has been breached. I have need of you. Do you accept?" "Yes," Naruto answered immediately, even as his eyes widened with surprise. His white porcelain mask blocked everything as he stood. "How may I serve?" Sarutobi turned around and Naruto saw the first traces of emotion, a grim, hard look that masked something dark that lurked beneath the old man's face. Whatever had happened, it was personal. "Several minutes ago I was assaulted within this very tower," Sarutobi began. He ignored Naruto's splutter of shock. The assailant successfully retrieved the scroll of forbidden seals and escaped. Shit. I have confirmed the identity of the attacker. Sarutobi sounded grim. He motioned to the table, where a gleaming sphere of crystal glimmered with chakra. At this moment, Sarutobi Konohamaru has left the boundaries of the village in possession of the forbidden scroll of seals. Naruto jerked reflexively and drew a deep breath. Confirm identity? He asked quickly. It's been confirmed, Sarutobi said tiredly, and for a moment he looked very old and very tired. He moved from the window and took a seat at the table. It was him, no. What's more, he knew exactly where to find the scroll and how to bypass the protections. With all due respect, Naruto asked carefully. But how did he subdue you? I merely, though it was one of his little tricks, Sarutobi admitted with a great sigh. He threw some smoke bombs, yelled something foolish out. I allowed him to play his game, but the smoke lasted longer than usual, and by the time it had cleared he was gone, with the scroll. He turned back to the window. This is a result of my foolishness, he said, and his voice was hard again. Naruto said nothing. Konohamaru was the grandson of the Third Hokage, and his status allowed him a lot of leeway. However, not even the Hokage could protect him from the outcome of this. The Forbidden Scroll of Seals was an S-ranked secret, and stealing it was paramount to high treason. There would be severe repercussions for all involved. Konohamaru for stealing it and Sarutobi for allowing it to happen. However, it is more complicated than that, Sarutobi interrupted Naruto's thought process. Konohamaru failed his graduation exam today. I have reason to suspect that somebody may be using his current emotional state for their own advantage. I see, Naruto murmured. His thoughts were conflicted and his emotions barely under control. He was too close to this at the moment, so, with a deep breath, he pulled back and hardened his heart. What are your orders, sir? I have located the boy. Sarutobi straightened, and the full force of his intent care bearing down on Naruto. It wasn't a desire to kill. Rather, it was the power of the highest priority order in Konoha and the effect it instilled in those with the will of fire. You will shadow him until the true culprit appears. Retrieve my grandson at all costs and destroy the scroll if necessary. Sarutobi met Naruto's eyes from behind his mask. Do to the culprit as you see fit. You have full operational control, however, the nature of the assignment have been deemed S-ranked and may not be divulged. Even if Konohamaru had been deceived, he had still committed high treason. Naruto understood immediately. The less who knew, the better. He bowed his head and made his way to the table where a large map of Konoha had been unraveled. Sarutobi gave the coordinates to Konohamaru's position, and Naruto stared intently at the map for a few moments. He then pressed his finger on his tattoo. Cat, he called out quietly. Bird. There was a moment's pause, and then two ANBU members arrived with a small puff of smoke, heads immediately bowing as they saw their Hokage. They wore white cloaks over their armor, and their porcelain masks bore the discreet signs of seniority. The ANBU captains of Epsilon and Omega ANBU combat platoons stood rigid. As the Hokage's assistant and the only member of the Sigma squad, the Hokage's personal guard, Naruto technically held seniority over them in theory. His commands were most often the commands of the Third Hokage and had to be respected. However, it was very seldom that Naruto interacted with the captains and only really saw them at the General Purpose Division meeting every couple of months. In this situation, though, Naruto had full operational control and commanded not only the captains but their 25-man platoons. Priority Directive Number 1. I have full operational control, Naruto said quietly. Two emotionless masks shifted and stared at him with greater intensity. Cat, your platoon will surround the perimeter of A4F to F5C. Entry denial. He paused and glanced at the map. Move out immediately. Dismissed. Cat disappeared and Boar waited patiently as Naruto studied the map carefully. Boar, you'll position your platoon to cover sections G3A to G3Z, Naruto concluded, tracing his finger across the map. Deny entry and detain those attempting to exit. I will be within that zone shadowing the target. Backup may be required. Go! Boar nodded and disappeared, leaving Naruto and Sarutobi alone in the room. Once he was gone, Naruto gazed at Sarutobi. The third Hokage nodded once, approving Naruto's plans, and the young ANBU let out a quiet sigh of relief. This was the first time he had ever had full operational control over such an urgent mission. He had been present over dozens, if not hundreds, of mission briefings and had watched as he stood loyally by the Hokage's side as the ANBU captains and Jonin commander had talked in short terse words over whatever mission they were planning. Even the ANBU commander had interjected at one point, the enigmatic figure saying 3 words that, in hindsight, had entirely changed the outcome of the mission. Naruto was just hoping some of that had sunk in. It might have been a bit of an overkill to drag out a 2 out of the 6 ANBU combat platoons, but Naruto wasn't taking any chances with such a dangerous S-ranked artifact on the loose. The mission has commenced, Naruto told his Hokage quietly. He paused. I will bring him home. A second later, the third Hokage was alone. The sun had fully set by the time Naruto had arrived on the outskirts of the village. Many shinobi would be disadvantaged or even crippled by the lack of visible light. However, the ANBU had 2 powerful accessories to help them with nighttime operations. The first was their cloak. Embedded with many different seals, an ANBU's cloak when combined with their armor was able to deflect shuriken, dull the blows of a thrust kunai, and even dent the blade of a sword swing. The cloak was water-resistant, fireproofed, and mud and dirt simply slid off of it. It was treated and woven in a way that made it extremely resistant to tears and burns, and when kept out of the light, the cloak seemed to fade into the darkness until shinobi and shadows were one. The second was the ANBU mask. Many of the white porcelain masks didn't even have eye holes, but it was no deterrent or disadvantage to the ANBU wearing them. They were specifically crafted for each individual shinobi, molded perfectly onto their faces for a seamless fit. When wearing it, one did not feel the weight of it at all. Ingenious seals, dating back to the era of the first Hokage, allowed the user to see through the solid plate as if it weren't there. The mask filtered out most poisons in the air while still allowing the shinobi to use his or her nose to sniff out enemies, although the mask would automatically filter everything out if an unidentified and especially pervasive poison was detected. The ANBU had learnt this the hard way from the Second Shinobi War against the village hidden in sand. In a very similar way to the cloak, the mask kept dirt and sand out away from the face, and it was impossible to block or impair the user's vision. Even the effects of flashbangs were diluted. Retina-scorching light merely became irritating. The opposite could also hold true, and the mask allowed ANBU operating in nighttime to see more accurately. There was a rumor that Konoha's research and development department were trying to come up with a way of attuning the masks to be able to see the heat of living organisms, but so far nothing had come of it. Beneath his mask and hidden in the shadows, Naruto silently watched from a large tree branch as Konohamaru pored over the forbidden scroll of seals. His chakra suppressed as best he could, Naruto controlled his breathing and remained motionless, ignoring the large part of him that wanted to storm down into the small clearing and whack the stupid brat over the head. His feelings were only slightly abetted as he took in the young boy's pure desperation, Konohamaru trying desperately to master one of the techniques in the scroll. Naruto kept a very careful eye on the boy. The techniques were forbidden for a reason, but so far the brown-haired child hadn't even come close to mastering one. Breathe in, breathe out, breathe in, breathe out. After 20 minutes, a motionless Naruto was beginning to get impatient. He had detected no other presence within distance and hadn't seen any signal flares go up at the various choke points he had assigned the two ANBU platoons at. There was no sign of the unknown mastermind threat. Naruto's eyes darted to the left, but he didn't move his head as he detected the slight vibration of movement. Somebody was pushing through the undergrowth, plants rustling loudly as this person didn't even attempt to hide. Naruto waited, and with a twitch of his fingers the spring-loaded mechanism in his right cloak sleeve placed a kunai into his hand. Who was it? The figure burst into the clearing and Naruto tensed, ready to move in. Some part of him was surprised at the identity of the man as Yumino Irika, Konohamaru's teacher, glared down at the surprised-looking boy. "You!" he roared. "What have you done?" Naruto paused. Hey! Konohamaru waved at Irika nervously. "You're too early. I haven't learned a technique yet. Give me some more time, please." "More time?" Irika roared. He lunged forward and snatched the scroll out of Konohamaru's hands. "You shouldn't even be looking at this, you idiot. Do you want to kill yourself?" Naruto frowned. Despite his anger, he could see and feel the concern and worry in the scarred Chunin's voice. What was going on here? "But the test," Konohamaru protested. He reached for the scroll. "I haven't finished the test yet." "What test?" Irika unknowingly echoed Naruto's question. "The test Mizuki-sensei gave me," Konohamaru said quietly. He bowed his head. He said that it was a shame that a descendant of the Third Hokage could fail their graduation test. He said that there was a secret test, where you passed if you could prove that you were a shinobi. I had to steal this scroll and learn a technique, but they're too hard. Irika was staring at Konohamaru with a strange look on his face. "But," he said quietly, "it was Mizuki who told me that you had stolen the scroll and told me where you had ran off to." He trailed off as it became clear. Naruto would have intervened right there and then, but he was taken completely by surprise as something flashed in the corner of his eye. He moved his head just in time as kunai pierced the trunk behind him. He didn't dodge the next set as they slammed into his chest, 3 blades thrown with unnerving accuracy at his vital points. The cloak and armor absorbed most of the blow, but Naruto heard a crack and grunted in pain. An instant later, wires wrapped around his chest and arms, binding and trapping him to the trunk of the tree. Something shifted in the darkness and 2 gleaming windmill shurikens came spinning at him. One was set to sever his head. The other exploded and a shower of deadly debris rained down on the cloaked figure bound to the tree. There was a blur of movement as Naruto dropped from underneath his cloak, leaving it still bound to the tree. He felt a streak of white-hot pain slash at his face and felt thuds against the back of his armor as he dropped to the ground and leapt forward. "Get down!" Naruto shouted, flickering over to the surprised Irika and Konohamaru, who had only just looked up. Between the second short ambush and his escape, he had distinctly heard sizzling. He threw himself over Konohamaru just as the tree he had been hiding in exploded in a great ball of fire. The ground roared and shuddered, the shockwave disorientating and throwing Naruto off. It only cost him seconds, but seconds was all that the mysterious assailant needed. He rolled to his feet, a kunai in his hand, prepared to defend from a second attack. He had no need. Irika stood in front of the 2 boys, arms outstretched as multiple kunai littering his body. Naruto observed him clinically. The armor had blocked most of the damage and no vital points had been hit. "Mizuki!" Irika growled. "Come out!" There was laughter from the trees, and a figure appeared on a tree branch further up from the burning remains where Naruto had been standing. The man was dressed in a chunin vest and had silver hair and cold blue eyes. "Irika, this really doesn't concern you," he said, idly spinning a kunai in his hand. He only had eyes for Naruto, however, and watched him keenly as the young ANBU stood up. "All I want is the scroll and the kid and I'll go. There's no need to die over this." "You traitor!" Irika breathed. "Mizuki!" Naruto called out, even as he unwrapped the bandage strapped round his leg and began binding his shoulder. His armor had been cracked and dented, but it had held up, but the edge of his mask had shattered and there was something warm and sticky dripping down his cheek. "There are 4 ANBU patrols and the Third Hokage surrounding the area. You will not escape. Surrender and you will be spared." "You know, I think I'll take my chances," Mizuki said with a grin that told Naruto that he was entirely too confident. "I'm a smart guy. I'll find a way out." He already had a way out, Naruto realized abruptly. He reached for his flares only to pause. They had been stashed away in his robe which, if it hadn't been turned to ashes by now, was surrounded by a blazing fire. ANBU equipment was tough, but not tough enough to come out of ground zero of detonating grade 1 explosive notes. "You're not that smart," Naruto remarked dryly, and he snapped his fingers. Shadow clones that had been observing from other trees launched themselves at the traitor, who actually looked surprised as he jumped away from tree. As Mizuki and the shadow clones engaged in hand-to-hand combat, Naruto whirled around to Irika and Konoha. "Irika," Naruto called. "Can you move?" "Yes." Irika gritted out between clenched teeth. "I'm giving you a priority S-ranked mission." Naruto commanded. "You are to take the scroll and Konohamaru and leave the area. Move 4 clicks west and you'll find reinforcements. Understand?" Irika nodded as Konohamaru looked on tearfully. 3 loud puffs of smoke filled the clearing as Mizuki dispelled the 3 of the 4 clones. "Naruto!" The young boy sobbed. A moment later, Irika had bundled both him and the clone up and quickly fled the area. Naruto turned to Mizuki as he finished off the last shadow clone and analyzed. The target had shown impressive close combat capabilities. His stealth was high, although it was likely he had been waiting before Naruto had arrived and saw where the young ANBU had hidden. Weapon skills high. Ninjutsu unknown. Genjutsu unknown but possible adequate considering he had crept up on Naruto. "I'll catch them." Mizuki snarled as he whirled around to face Naruto. Naruto gave him a cold glance and his emotionless white mask turned to face the traitor. "No you won't," was all he said. He launched at Mizuki at great speeds and enjoyed the brief look of surprise in the older man's eyes. Naruto's taijutsu depended on great speed and integration with weaponry to deal damage. As a 12-year-old, he was too small and lacked the bulk of experienced close combat fighters. His speed, however, was what allowed him to go toe-to-toe with bigger and stronger opponents. Feint left, strike with kunai on the right. Duck kick, jump back from follow-up. Body flicker behind, avoid reflexive punch. Parry blow. Redirect punch. Slash at tendons. Reach into pouch. Jump to avoid low house kick. Throw shuriken. Lunge with stab. Parry blow. Pull back on wires to bring shuriken back. Replacement. Both Naruto and Mizuki used the replacement technique as a series of shurikens punctured the silver-haired Chunin's back at the same time Mizuki landed a powerful kick underneath Naruto's chin. A windmill shuriken was flying from the shadows as Naruto reappeared on the ground. The ANBU let his chakra flare, feeling it slam down on the entire clearing, and weaved his hand seals. Wind release, great breakthrough. A roaring wave of wind slammed into the shuriken and sent it spiraling into the air as the tree branches rustled. A second later, the ground grumbled and a series of large rocky spikes shot up and slammed Naruto in the chest. He gurgled as Mizuki jumped up from underneath the ground and shoved a kunai into the ANBU's mask with a loud metallic clang. "Gotcha!" the traitor grinned maliciously. He paused and narrowed his eyes. "Wait!" The sound of metal whistling through the air made him jump back, and the henge on the windmill shuriken that Naruto had replaced himself with disappeared. Reappearing in the air, Naruto launched a series of kunai at Mizuki and blazed through a set of hand seals. Fire release, soaring flame bullets. Naruto felt his chest swell as chakra burst from the tenketsu in his throat and upper mouth. Fire elemental chakra poured from the points, and Naruto manipulated the shape of the chakra to take form of a volley of blazing streaks of fire. They crashed to the ground, engulfing Mizuki and the windmill shuriken in flames. Naruto narrowed his eyes as he dropped gracefully to the ground and crouched there. He flipped through another series of hand seals and pressed his hands to the ground. Lightning release, electromagnetic murder. From his hand came a furious discharge of surging bolts of lightning. They tore through the ground, tearing apart the earth and soil. There was a strangled yell as Naruto pumped his chakra into the ground and a flash of movement jumped up away from him. Mizuki leapt from the ground, his armor in pieces and holding his arm, and ducked behind a tree as Naruto lifted his hands and sent waves of cascading lightning after him. "You won't win!" Mizuki yelled desperately as Naruto dispelled the technique, lowering his hands. "I didn't want to have to use this so soon, but I can't let you win." Naruto felt the ground shifting again and, chakra pumping into his feet, he jumped gracefully away, landing on the tree branch of a nearby tree. The earlier fire techniques had dissipated as the chakra within it was burned up, but the acrid smell of smoke filled the air, blocked only partially by his mask. "Forbidden technique!" Mizuki cried out. "Animal cursed seal of heaven!" Naruto crouched, watching the tree where Mizuki had hid warily. He started as something boomed, and before his astonished eyes the tree trunk shattered and buckled. With a loud groan, the top of the tree came crashing down and slammed into the ground. The tree Naruto was standing on creaked and groaned but otherwise remained still as Mizuki appeared from behind the tree. What was that? Naruto thought. Where Mizuki had once stood there was now a monster, or something that looked a lot like it. A muscle-bound behemoth of a thing stood there, flexing its hands in marvel. It was bipedal, covered in orange fur with thick black stripes adorning its hide. A mane of whitish-silvery hair covered its ears and draped down over its face, where two murderous blue eyes glinted. "Mizuki!" Naruto breathed. "This is it." Mizuki howled. He slammed a fist into the palm of his large clawed hand. "This is the power I wanted. Thank you, my lord. You have delivered exactly what you promised." He turned his ferocious gaze on Naruto and the muscles in his new thick thighs tensed. In a sudden burst of speed, he had cleared the distance between Naruto and himself in a flash, his fist cocked back. Naruto flinched at the sudden speed and narrowly sidestepped the first punch. His leg came up instinctively and he shifted his balance, thrusting his knee into the exposed behemoth's chest. Mizuki roared and Naruto winced. ANBU jumped back to avoid a swipe of the claws and disappeared in a whirlwind of smoke and leaves. He reappeared some distance away, his knee throbbing with pain. His hand came up and with a puff of smoke 24 shadow clones appeared. "Go!" Naruto ordered and they obeyed, launching themselves from behind the tree and moving to engage the new and improved traitor. He created 2 more clones and together they weaved a series of hand seals, each one ending on a different sign. A series of loud pops echoed through the forest as the beast-like Mizuki had no trouble dispelling the clones. Fire release, Fire Dragon Flame Bullet Technique. Earth release, Seismic Upheaval Technique. Wind release, Wind Cutter Technique. Mizuki, who had just finished off the land shadow clone in hand-to-hand combat, felt the ground rumbling and the trees howling, looked up in horror. The original Naruto poured his elemental chakra and released it from his mouth in a giant stream of fire. He held his hands up as he directed the flames, a third of the torrent burrowing underneath the ground, a third rushing straight ahead and a third spirally into the sky. Fire elemental chakra blended with wind and the fire exploded as blades of wind tore through it. Flame and wind spun together with a high-pitched shriek and the streams of fire in the air and on the ground met to create a wall of flame that encompassed trees and plants, reducing them to ash in mere seconds. Fire and earth elemental chakra also met as the earth technique melded with the fire technique. The ground rumbled and was torn apart as geysers of exploding soil roared up into the heavens, great gouts of fire ripping through rock and stone in seconds. There was nowhere for Mizuki to run. He made a series of signs and slammed his hands to the ground. Earth release, earth-style wall. The soil beneath his fingers trembled as chakra was poured into it, and it rose up and took the form of a muddied wall twice as tall and once as thick as Mizuki. Earth elemental chakra raced over the surface. The wall hardened into thick gleaming stone that flickered from the light of the wall of flame coming towards it. Mizuki leapt up and gripped the side of the walls with the soles of his feet. He slammed his bestial hands on the stone just as the wind-enhanced fire struck the wall. The wall glowed from the pressure and heat of wall of flame and shuddered as the earth around it exploded in pillars of fire and mud. Shrapnel tore at him, cutting into his fur and hardened muscle, and Mizuki howled with pain, but he kept his hands on the rock, pouring as much chakra as he could spare into his only defense. The fire looked as if it would overcome him, but after a few moments it abated and the wall held, cracked and trembling but whole. He was completely unprepared for the 4 shadow clones that darted from around both sides of the wall and lunged at him. A kunai flashed as Mizuki tensed his muscles and leapt off the wall. The first shadow clone bridged the distance and plunged his blade deep into the beast's knee. The second ignored Mizuki's howl of agony as it stabbed its kunai deep into his torso. The third jumped up above him and grabbed the fourth's arm, pulling with all its might and sending the shadow clone plummeting down to deliver a nasty rib-crushing kick to the airborne Chunin. Mizuki slammed into the ground with great force and little warning. The earth, churned and baked, seared into his fur and he yelped, rising up on his one good leg and panting as blood dribbled from his mouth. His body so filled with the sensation of pain and burning, he didn't feel the slight vibrations below him until the ground below him cracked and parted as something jumped up from underneath him. Rasengan! A bright whirring orb of spinning chakra caught Mizuki right in the chest. He howled in agony as the chakra spun away, tearing into flesh, muscle, and bone. The force of the technique propelled him up into the sky, where the third and last shadow clone was ready for him. With another devastating kick, Mizuki was slammed back into the ground. This time, he didn't get up. The shadow clones dispersed as Naruto jumped up from the ground. His armor was muddied and blood dripped from the crevice of his mask, but underneath his blue eyes was fierce and proud. It was with slight apprehension that Naruto watched the transformed Mizuki start to shrivel up and waste away. In a few minutes, there was only a wasted husk of a man left. The chest rose once, twice, and then stopped moving at all. Sometime later, a bandaged and thoroughly debriefed Naruto walked quietly through the Hokage's residence. The scroll of forbidden seals had been secured and Konohamaru had been returned safely to his home. All in all, Naruto was satisfied, if not aching, tired and ready for a good rest. He passed Konohamaru's room in the hallway and paused. Sarutobi had undoubtedly heard him coming, but he didn't move from the doorway, watching Konohamaru peacefully sleep off the night's chaos. Naruto hesitated and then moved forward to step next to the Hokage. "Is he all right?" Naruto murmured, eyeing Konohamaru's tear-streaked face. "He's fine," Sarutobi answered quietly. "A little wiser, perhaps, and most certainly a little jaded, but it will be good for him. This is a dangerous business we partake in." Naruto said nothing, but he felt a pang of concern. He knew that the third Hokage was old, but he had never truly seen it until just then. The god of shinobi looked very old, very tired, and very frail. The weight of decades of service bowed his shoulders and hunched his back. There was no hint of the power and strength that Naruto was accustomed to, and he hesitated. "You are dismissed, Naruto," Sarutobi murmured. "Sir," Naruto acknowledged automatically. "Naruto," Sarutobi said as the blonde ANBU turned to leave. Naruto paused. "Thank you." Naruto shifted in surprise. The old man did not usually deliver his praise or approval so blatantly. "It's my duty," he said honestly, "and a privilege." For the one who had rescued Naruto from the hell of loneliness and despair, who had given him the strength needed to protect the village, and who have given him a familiar and those to care and protect, this evening's task had been nothing. Sarutobi turned and managed a smile. "I'll see you in the morning," he murmured, and Naruto dipped his head. The third Hokage waited until he heard the door to Naruto's room close before he turned back to Konohamaru. He smiled somewhat sadly. "Your son has turned out to be a splendid shinobi, Minato," he mused. "Perhaps that will be enough to earn your forgiveness."